Welcome to Coffee Break with Rachel Vigil, taking a daily look at the biggest stories in Denver sports and interacting live with you, the Coffee Break fam. So sit back, relax, grab a cup of joe, and enjoy your coffee break. Here's your host, Rachel Vigil.
Another day of Broncos practice in the book. Bo Nix, officially quarterback number one. We can finally stop talking about who's going to be the quarterback, but there's also so many other position battles that we do need to talk about, Maze. We know who the quarterback's going to be, but let's look ahead because cut down day is going to be here before we know it. And I feel like a lot of the times we're focusing on the offensive side of things, wide receivers, running backs. It's like, which one of those guys? There's so much talent there. But I really want to focus on the defensive side of things. And I'm just curious, which position group are you really looking at when it comes to cut down day?
I'm looking at defensive line, for example. I mean, you've had guys like Jordan Jackson, Angelo Blackson emerge, whereas you have somebody like Matt Henningsen who's been on the roster for the last couple of years. Is there room for him with maybe a couple of guys who might be more dynamic in there? I mean, Henningsen fills a very kind of specific role that every team likes to have, that reserve who can play all three spots and is something of a plugger. But he hasn't flashed in the preseason the way he did the last couple of preseasons. So looking at D-line, I'm looking at safety on the back end. Keydron Smith, who's had interceptions in each of the last couple of games. Every year there's a preseason game darling. He's it right now. Is there room for him? How many safeties do they keep? If the Broncos keep 4 safeties on the roster, is he one of them? Does he end up nudging out J.L. Skinner, who really, in terms of his work on defense, has failed to launch? He's considered a core player on special teams, but it hasn't come together on defense to the point where Devin Key is clearly ahead of him in terms of the safety depth chart. So I'll be looking at that as well. Curious to see how inside linebacker and edge shake out too. Are they Broncos going to keep 4 inside backers, 4 edges, or are they going to keep 5 of one or maybe 5 of both? And with the new kickoff rules, they're trying to figure out what kind of players fit best on kickoffs, and that's going to affect the back end of the roster too. There's a lot more questions toward the end of the roster than I think there have been in some time.
No, and it's fun, right? Because there is this level of competition that we're watching. The third game does feel meaningful for a lot of these guys in more so ways than maybe years past. But at the exact same time, there is a lot of talent on this team that you're having to really dissect at a pretty intense level to figure out who can be the best 53-man roster, right? Sean Payton talks about it all the time of like, we have to figure out the best 53-man roster because another team's probably going to come take somebody if we let them go.
Yeah, and that's where playing the practice squad elevation game comes into play. You're figuring out which players you could slip through the practice squad. Now, if they're not vested veterans, if they're 4 years or fewer, they're subject to the waiver process, which means any team could claim them for their 53-player roster. But if they are vested veterans, then what you can do is tell them, hey, we're going to bring you back in a day or two. And they don't necessarily have to go report somewhere else. It got me thinking about the quarterback position, Rachel, not the starter. That's obviously set. But Jarrett Stidham's a vested veteran. Could you go to him and say, look, we'll bring you back in a day or two, or maybe you'll go on the practice squad and be back on the roster in 2 weeks. And very similar to how in a recent year they cut Mike Purcell and brought him back a day later to kind of play the injured reserve game a bit. They brought him back on the same contract terms. And the thing that got me thinking about this, Rachel, was Sean Payton, when he was on with Chase Daniel and Diana Rossini on their podcast, talking with Chase Daniel about a story from back in 2009 where Daniel, he'd been cut by Washington. He's about to sign a practice squad contract with Washington. Sean Payton gets a hold of him and says, if we bring you here on our practice squad, I promise you in 2 weeks, you're going to be on the 53-player roster. And he was. So Sean Payton on that sort of thing is the guy who keeps his promises. Is that a way to maybe be able to squeeze in all 3 of these quarterbacks while also creating a roster spot that you may want to use on somebody who may not play, but can't slip through? Kind of like J.L. Skinner and Thomas Incoom last year. Does the same thing happen this year with Troy Franklin, who doesn't appear to have a prominent role at wide receiver, but there's no way you could slip him through waivers and get him to the practice squad. So he's going to be on the 53, even though he's probably not among the 53 best Bronco players right now.
Well, isn't it so fascinating, Mace, how you have to really, like, you're truthfully playing chess at a certain degree. It's a puzzle having to put together because, we've seen Troy Franklin not be good, but because of his draft status, some team's going to say, oh, we want him, compared to a guy like little Jordan Humphrey, who maybe he's been a little bit more aggressive in camp. I feel like that might be a disservice to Troy Franklin. He struggled clearly during camp. But because of his draft status, you have to say, little Jordan Humphrey, sorry, you're going to go on the practice squad, and we can't put Troy Franklin there, even though maybe you might see a little bit more of little Jordan Humphrey compared to Troy Franklin this entire season.
Right. And in fact, you could probably say with little Jordan Humphrey, you slip him through the practice squad. And again, he's a vested veteran, not subject to the waiver process. And your plan is, because you need him on special teams, you activate him for the first 3 games. Use your 3 elevations that you're permitted per season on him, per season per player. Use those 3 elevations. And then usually you've got somebody getting injured or whatever, and then a roster spot opens up. But the other thing is, like, as you get to midseason this year, you're probably going to have Delarian Turner-Yell and Drew Sanders coming off the PUP list at some time between early October and mid-November. So those are a couple of roster spots as well, but they won't count against the 53. But that's another thing to consider, that you're expecting to be able to have a roster spot open up to move them up. But the elevation game, the 3 practice squad elevations, that's something the Broncos use as well as anybody in this league, and I'd expect that they would do that again, that some of the guys that they cut, it's the intention of bringing them back and then using those elevations right away until they can kind of stabilize things on the roster. Guys get hurt, spots open up, etc.
I've been talking to everybody about it because at wide receiver, there's so much depth, but there's so many players that are so very similar at the exact same time, Mace. So I'm just curious, if you had to name, who do you think will make the 53 on the wide receiver room?
I would go with Courtland Sutton, Tim Patrick, Josh Reynolds, Marvin Mims Jr., Troy Franklin, and Devon Vele.
Okay. So we're all kind of on the exact same path then of those are the guys. But I mean, there's still a lot of talent in that wide receiver room, but a lot of those guys probably wouldn't, have other teams picking up the phone and maybe call them and see what they're able to do.
Yeah, and I think there are a couple of others that you're going to cross your fingers on some of them. Jalen Virgil, for example, is coming off the knee injury last year, so he isn't all the way back, but we've seen some flashes from him on kickoff returns so far this summer. And I think the Broncos would like to slip him through the practice squad and keep working with him there until he gets all the way back. I mean, unfortunately, because he came back for the start of camp, he's been practicing. The PUP list isn't an option. They could have, if they decided to kind of wait on him, they could have played that game a little bit, but that's not something that they can do. So this is there's a lot of roster gymnastics that are going to go on here in the next week. And if it's quarterback, like that would be one of the more noble ones, but there are going to be some interesting ones down the line. And that's why I think a guy like Blake Watson is in an interesting spot as well, because he was one of the Broncos' priority undrafted players. They were even thinking about drafting him. Like if Audric Estime had gone off the board before the Broncos picked in round 5, there's a decent chance Blake Watson would have been selected right then and there.
Yep.
And it wouldn't have been a reach at that point based on where he stacked up among draft running backs. And I think there's a long-term path to a role for Blake Watson. He started camp on NFI and he's kind of struggled to catch up. There have been some flashes more and more, but there's a specific role down the line for him as a pass-catching running back in this offense. And are they going to want to risk exposing him to the waiver wire rather than when, they might be able to make it, to slip other guys through? That's part of it. You're trying to read the room of the other 31 teams who would have a crack. And so that's part of why JL Skinner was kept on the 53 last year, 6th round pick who had slipped in the draft. It's part of why they kept Thomas Incoom on the 53 last year. Now, both of those are very much bubble guys. Could see them both making it, could also see them getting caught in a squeeze.
Well, and we know Sean Payton pays attention to what all the other teams are doing, right? We heard the draft night story with the Raiders. Like, we know he pays attention to all of these things. So I'm sure he's having his little phone calls trying to figure out what other teams are looking for and needing, and also figuring out his roster at the exact same time. Real quick, just because we do have to talk kind of about the long term, and Blake Watson, we both agree, is in the long-term plans for this team, you can't ignore the fact that Javonte Williams is on a contract year. Like, you have to be able to look at that and say, well, what's the future going to be for this running back room if they decide to look ahead and just let his contract kind of run out? And it's a short-term life in the NFL for running backs at the exact same time, Mace.
Yeah. And there are running backs available every year. So, I mean, there'll be another crop coming in next year's draft too.
Yep.
But in terms of the skills and how they fit and what their likely roles are, you don't need binoculars to look over the horizon and see that if things work out as the Broncos would like, they could have a running back room by 2025 of Audric Estime, Jaleel McLaughlin, and Blake Watson, with Estime being your first and second down back, Jaleel McLaughlin being your situational back. It's actually been interesting to see his role expand in the last couple of weeks as well. It's one of the reasons why I think everyone who does the roster projection probably says Samaje Perine might be the most notable cut next week, is because you can see Jaleel eating into Samaje's carries. And then Blake Watson, who is a very good pass catcher out of the backfield. It was that specific skill set that really intrigued the Broncos. And he, Jaleel maybe becomes your 2-minute back, your situational back. Blake Watson perhaps becomes your third down back, the one who's a bit more of a threat in the passing game as well. To those, and there are three backs that do three different sets of things well.
Yep.
And we know Sean Payton, even though he's had success with like an Alvin Kamara, in the course of his career, he loves the backfield by committee. He loves I've got, Reggie Bush for this role. I had, going way back, he had Deuce McAllister, he had, Pierre Thomas. He loves those kind of chess piece mix and match type things that he's done over the years.
It is so crazy to me that Sean Payton has been coaching since Reggie Bush was a Saint. Like, that feels like a lifetime ago, and yet we're still talking about him being one of the best offensive minds in the game. Like, that feels like a lifetime ago, Mace.
Yeah, that was 18 years ago, and that was his first draft pick.
Crazy. Like, how far we've come and how much the game has changed.
It was because that offseason was right after they signed Drew Brees. And I think Drew Brees was something of a mystery coming off of the elbow injury. Reggie Bush was kind of regarded as this is the guy that's going to change this franchise more so than Drew Brees at the time. Of course, how little we end up knowing about what Brees had left in the tank and how perfect a fit he was for that offense, which now brings us to today. And Sean Payton has his most ballyhooed new quarterback since 2006, his first season. Doesn't it feel, Rachel, kind of like the Sean Payton era really starts this year, not so much last year?
100. It feels like Russell Wilson feels like a lifetime ago, even though it really wasn't that long ago. Do you agree?
Yeah, although whenever there's a story post on Russell Wilson at denversports.com and I see all the numbers, and it's like, oh man, people are still clicking on it. It's kind of like, we wouldn't put the stories up if people weren't clicking on them, right? I always say clickbait, that people mock that. You know what? It wouldn't exist if you didn't click on it. So, 100%. Who's at fault for the Denver media continuing to put Russell Wilson's stories up? It's, I'm going to go all Kent Brockman here. Put this blame squarely on you, the reader.
Well, and it's just it was so divided of it was either Sean Payton's fault or it was Russell Wilson's fault. And people want to know, right? There's going to be an answer at the end of the season unless they both somehow end up with the exact same record and all of these same crazy stat lines when it comes to both offenses. But right now it feels like Sean Payton's winning the breakup and Russell Wilson is still, unfortunately, just going downhill.
Well, let's see what happens in week 2.
I know. I can't. If he doesn't play because of injury, I'm going to be so disappointed.
What if he doesn't play because he's benched?
Honestly, at least we know that. If it's like he dodged the game, right? Like we always talk about Joel Embiid, like he's hurt going against Nikola Jokic, and it's like, oh, you just babied out on this game. I'm going to say some like PG language right there. If that same thing happens with Russell Wilson, I'm going to be pissed.
Yeah.
We'll see. But
we'll see. I don't want to think about. I'd like to think Russ, as a competitor, would want to go out there and play, but so far what we've seen coming out of Pittsburgh isn't great. And I was talking with a friend about this last night. It's the very real possibility if Russell Wilson washes out in Pittsburgh after washing out in Denver. Sean Payton and Mike Tomlin are very respected coaches who know what the heck they're doing. If you wash out with both of them, I don't see a future in the NFL for Russell Wilson.
Question for sure. So we'll see.
It means I think he'll be a Hall of Famer. I think the first ballot is sailing away right now.
Would totally agree with that. And not taking away from anybody who goes into the Hall of Fame, but it feels like if you can be a first ballot guy, like that's how you know you were the top of your game and all that jazz.
To me, that should be the standard for retiring a jersey for the Broncos. Obviously, you can't unretire any. So you're going to keep 18 for Tripucka. You're going to keep 44 for Floyd Little. But since then, the Broncos have had 3 first ballot Hall of Famers, and they are John Elway, Champ Bailey, and Peyton Manning. Of course, 18 is now retired for Tripucka and Manning as well. 7's retired. It's why I would retire 24. I think that is a good standard to have. And then there's there's no subjectivity to it. It's an objective standard. First ballot Hall of Fame for your accomplishments as a Bronco. No one's wearing that jersey again. So
yes, mate.
In my mind, that's why the Broncos haven't issued 58 since Von Miller. Yep. I'm keeping 58 out because I don't want another Pac-Man Jones situation where some guy comes in and briefly wears that number and it's ridiculous. And since that happened, the Broncos have not reissued 24. They haven't reissued 58. The other one they haven't reissued since his death is that of the late Demaryius Thomas. That's definitely more. He's not going to be a first ballot Hall of Famer. He's probably not going to be a Hall of Famer at all. And that's definitely more kind of sentimental. But 24 and 58, I mean, to me,
yesterday.
Yeah, that would actually be my big thing for 2025. Would be retiring 24, like the big ceremonial thing.
And I
retiring jersey 24. Me too.
I might have to go to that game as a fan. All right, Andrew Mason, I appreciate you as always. Happy Friday to everybody hanging out with us in the comments. We appreciate all of you, and we will see you on Monday when cuts will probably start beginning. Crazy stuff. We'll see you guys then. Bye.